Hello, this is Lynn Wilson with our third lecture on the series for the anniversary of the 200th celebration of Joseph's first vision. But today we get to move on to his next set of visions, which were with Moroni. And there is a fabulous wealth of information on this next 3 years in his life between 1820 and 1821. But before we jump into the history and the scriptures, I would love to just take a minute and think about how Joseph prepared to receive revelation. In the history account that we have in the Pearl of Great Price, he goes into great detail before the first vision about how he prepared. And he does the same thing before his vision with Moroni. He talks about pondering and thinking and analyzing and having these desires to pray. And I just want you to take a moment and think about not only how Joseph prepared to receive revelation, but how you prepare to receive revelation. I realize that we each have a calling and a responsibility. We each have been asked by God to have a personal mission here on earth, between our first estate and second estate. And I also feel like this preparation for the revelation determines what revelation we receive. And we all sat on the edge of our seats in my family when the prophet was giving his first talk as a new prophet in April of 2018. And when President Nelson said, "I've been praying to know what the Lord would have me teach," and he said, we all needed to understand the Spirit better. Does God really want to speak to you? Yes! I could just see him up there waving both arms and wanting to be as animated as he could. There is so much more that your Father in heaven wants you to know. And not only was Joseph visited by angels, but I believe all mortals have angelic ministers to them. And when we seek inspiration, we receive more. And when we call upon the Lord, he will provide mortal and immortal help if we are doing all we can to hear and act on the promptings we receive. So now let's jump in. 1820 was the first vision, and 1821, Lucy has her last baby. And I wrote down here that it was the 10th child, but actually she had a stillborn as well. And but this cute little baby girl that's born in 1821 completed their family. And I just want you to realize the dynamics of what it does to a home to have a little toddler around. At the same time, you have now 11 people living in the home, and what it does when the baby wakes up in the middle of the night to all 11 people. And emotionally, the blessings of having a wee one there to love and cuddle and hold. But Joseph Sr. and Lucy had an enormous span. Alvin is born before the turn of the century. And, they've got a 24-year age span. I don't have the months memorized of when the birthdays are, but it's quite a distance here between the first and second child. But also during these 3 years, we know that they are actively gaining more and more acres. And they start out with just a few, and within a few years, they have 100 acres that they're trying to put under a mortgage, and they've stopped the paying rent to Mr. Jennings, and by 1823, they are able to act under their own with a mortgage that they're actively working on. I also wanted to remind you that also during these 3 years, Joseph we have other records that mention that he would meet with some of the other young men in the town before the first vision as well as afterward, and discuss issues of the day, which mainly were religious issues. And when Joseph was writing up his history that we have canonized in the Pearl Great Price, he mentions that he was left to all kinds of temptations and mingling with all kinds of society. Now, I know a lot about what the society was like in upstate New York. The hot topic is religion, but Joseph was also being hired out with money diggers, and the Western New York was sort of like the Western frontier. People were a little more rough, and even though religion is the hot topic of the day and it filters into everywhere, you still have people that are not living the messages of Jesus Christ as thoroughly as the Lord would like, or as Joseph knew he should be living. And I think that's what he's referring to when he talks about all kinds of society. He said, I frequently fell into many foolish errors and displayed the weakness of youth. I love this perspective that he had, and there isn't anyone by the time they get to 18, 19, or 20 that looks back without that same kind of realization. But the next phrase, that I felt guilty of levity and sometimes associated with jovial company, I just have to step back and say, I think Joseph had a different perspective on this because of the Puritan mentality that pervaded Northern America at this time. Remember that the Puritan mentality was still the number one religious thought and action in 1800. And Joseph is saturated with that. His mother was raised with that upbringing, and I personally feel like Joseph's fear of levity and jovial company may be in part because of that perspective. But I also feel very strongly that when one is called of God, sacred things need to be held sacred, and that there is a good, better, and best to everything we do. And Joseph, looking back on this period of time, sees that he wanted a better and best, and that he wanted regular inspiration and direction from the Lord. And I love this aspect about his record. Now, the artist in this next slide has shown a very clean and empty bedroom with a lovely headboard. So just let your mind go. Here's the reconstruction of the room where all the boys slept. So think of trundle beds being pulled out and nails on the walls where everyone hung their jackets and gloves and boots along the side. And you have 11 people living in this tiny little 24 by 30 home. And we probably had a few more people in the bed when Moroni came. But that should not dissuade us for a moment, because we have many evidences in the Bible where visions were seen by one person and not the others. I'm thinking specifically of Paul. In his 3 accounts of his first vision, he describes how he heard a voice and saw a light, but the people around him did not. And in one account, the people may have heard but did not see. And even in the Gospels, we have Peter and James and John with the Lord on the Mount of Transfiguration, and they fall asleep. They don't even watch the first half of the vision. And then it says they wake up and they see the part they needed to see. And I'm convinced that the Lord can take care of that. If an anesthesiologist can put us to sleep, I think the Lord can figure that out. And a deep sleep could have been held by the others in the bed. But this probably took up much of the night. Joseph said, he started praying, and the 3 visions last until the cock crows in the morning. And I am just wondering if each vision was a couple of hours long, at least, for this to occupy the night. The other thing that is really fascinating to me about this vision is how clear the details are. If you've ever read anything about like Muhammad's visions or other Christians' visions, you see a lot of vagueness, a lot of essence, and a lot of feelings, but not a lot of clarity. I even look at the Old Testament, and when Nebuchadnezzar is asking about the vision, asking Daniel, he doesn't say, "This is what I saw." He said, "Can you tell me what I saw?" Which was part of knowing who he was a prophet. I appreciate that. But there is no sense of hallucinations here in Joseph's descriptions. Things are black and white clear. He sees these wrists and ankles, and he sees no head covering, and he sees his bosom, his chest is open, and that the clothing is glorious beyond description. His face, he describes it like lightning. I just love that. And we know the story very well. He calls him by name. He introduces him by name. And in Joseph's visions, the angels are always named and have a mortal history, whether they are coming to earth before they are born, like Peter, James, and John did to Adam and Eve, or like Moroni, they are coming back as angels after, as in a resurrected format, or even like Moses did to Jesus before he was resurrected. There's lots of ways that people come and go, but it seems that one of the things that was restored to Joseph was this understanding of angels, which is fascinating to me because Christian history has been bombarded with interest on angels. And people had all sorts of theories on how communication from the heavens came and went, because they're all over the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they're all over Christian history. The Lord has continued to speak to those sincere seekers, whether or not they were baptized as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We have many, many, many examples of people who receive revelation when they seek it. But Joseph learned that there's not wings on these angels. And I personally feel like this would have been, if Joseph had made this up, his angels would have fit the description of the time, of the understanding of the Christianity in the 19th century America. And that is not how he is described. He is a glorious man. And then he describes, in addition to the description of angel Moroni, he describes the things that he was going to be able to see. And he goes into, Moroni tells him a lot about the plates that appeared to be made out of gold, and the breastplate, and the Urim and Thummim, and this and the Liahona, and Laban's sword. I'm fascinated with the fact that this Urim and Thummim was attached to a breastplate, because that is exactly how the Old Testament Urim and Thummim was in conjunction with the high priest's breastplate. Remember in Leviticus, when Aaron is given responsibility to act as the high priest in the tabernacle, he has a stone, a gem stone for each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the Urim and Thummim, which he keeps in a pocket inside the breastplate. And the way Joseph describes them here, the breastplate and the Urim and Thummim seem to also have a connection. But it's not the Urim and Thummim that was used by Aaron and his descendants. This is a Urim and Thummim that was used by the Nephites. And before that, I believe, it was used by the Jaredites, because there's this wonderful description in the small plates that the Jaredite record was left when Coriantumr was found by the people of Zedekiah, or the Mulekites, the king's people. Melech is king. Mulek is the same root as Melech, king. Mulekites is the king's people in Hebrew, just a different pronunciation with the vowels. And in the ancient language, there were no vowels in Hebrew. And they describe that there was a Urim and Thummim with the 24 plates that were found of the Jaredite record, which then Moroni retranslated as the Book of Ether. But Joseph's understanding of these wonderful sacred objects, I'm sure, was exciting, but I think it was even more exciting for Moroni to share it with him. I just love thinking about what this visit meant to Moroni. And, he had been preparing for this night for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I bet he was ecstatic to be able to move forward and share this sacred record. And I am sure that he had seen visions, we are told, of what was to come, and what a happy, happy, happy day for him to be able to move ahead with this sweet vision. And in Joseph's record of this, he says in Joseph Smith History, verse 43, "After this communication, I saw the light in the room began to gather immediately around the person of him who had been speaking to me. And it continued to do so until the room was again left dark, except just around him. And then instantly I saw, as it were, a conduit open right up into the heaven, and he ascended until it entirely disappeared, and the room was left as it had been before this heavenly light had made its appearance. I lay musing on the singularity of this scene, and marveling greatly at what had been told me by the extraordinary messenger, when in the midst of my meditation, I suddenly discovered that my room was again beginning to get lightened. And in an instant, as it were, the same heavenly messenger was again by my bedside." I think this would have been so exciting. Now, remember back in about verse 28, Joseph had said, "I kneeled down to pray knowing that I had full expectation that I was going to see a messenger." But I don't know if he thought that this messenger was going to come back again. I think this was really exciting for him. And in Lucy's record, we also get an account of what transpired that night from her memories. The first record that Lucy made was in 1844, and her account is written, and 45, it overlapped. It took her a while to get it all down. But her account in the original records is recorded in the Joseph Smith papers, and it's fabulous, and it's very easy to access. But when it was published, it had already been edited in 1853, and then enhanced, so that by the time it was published in 1920, it was no longer Lucy's words. Not only was the grammar and the punctuation and the spelling updated to be more current with the 20th century, but the story had a few holes in it, and they filled in the blanks. Conversations were elaborated on. And nowadays, that is not historically accurate. And so Lavina Fielding Anderson has given us a great gift by going back to Lucy's original manuscript and showing the changes in that first 1853 edition to show how they were made initially. And then the commentary and her footnotes are absolutely fabulous, giving us perspective and insights. So if you're really interested in reading Lucy's thoughts, I'd encourage you to go to the Joseph Smith papers online, or else look at Lucy's book in it as well, because we get sweet insights. And I've noticed as I've gone through the Great Gift of the Saints, I meant the book, the gift of the book, which we call the Saints, of the early history of the church, they rely heavily on Lucy's history, some of which they use is the edited version, but much of what they use is just the sweet messages of Lucy's pen, or not pen, but message that was recorded for her. And I want to read to you one of those sections. She begins, "The third harvest time was now arrived since we opened our new farm, and all our sons were actively employed in assisting their father to cut down the grain and storing it away in order." Now, remember Lucy's had a baby, and she's remembering back 20 years to this time. And also remember that it appears Joseph did not tell his mother about the first vision at that time. He told the minister, he told his mother that Presbyterian wasn't right, but in the next paragraph, it appears that Lucy gets these visions and dreams a little bit mixed up. And I think this is really good to appreciate. In history, our memory is not ever exact, and we all perceive things differently. And this is her memoirs, so I love it for what it is, but I'm really, really grateful that we have many records of this event, including first-person Joseph's. But here I'll continue on with Lucy's. Joseph never said many words upon any subject, but always seemed to reflect more deeply than common people of his age on everything in the religious nature. Oh, I had taken out a little section, but she talks about that they were at their family evening devotional in that September 21st, 1823. They were discussing the differences in religions. And then she continues, after we ceased the conversation, he, Joseph, went to bed, and while pondering in his mind which of the churches were the true one, but he had not laid there long till he saw a bright light enter the room, and when he looked up and saw an angel of the Lord standing by him. And the angel spoke, I perceive that you are inquiring in your mind which of the true church on earth. No, not one. And she continues on and goes into more details and gets to the Book of Mormon. And she doesn't include the things like Joel and Malachi and Isaiah that were repeated over and over. Joseph says, I can't record everything on the vision, but Joseph really emphasized his role as a prophet and the prophecies that would be fulfilled in the coming forth of the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. He also emphasizes that in this vision of Moroni, he understood his call as a prophet better, which is exactly what he was praying for. He was asking forgiveness, which I think is a fabulous way to begin all prayers, as the prophet has encouraged us to repent every day. But Lucy, after she refers to that evening of the vision, she gives us some more information, which is just terrific about what happened the next day. The next day, he, Joseph, and his father and Alvin were reaping in the field. Suddenly, Joseph stopped and seemed to be in a deep study for some time, and Alvin, his big brother, 7, 8, 9 years older, says, Come on, Joseph, we must get to work, or we shall not get our task done. And Joseph worked diligently and then stopped in the same way a second time. And his father saw him, that he was very pale, and he urged him to go to the house and tell his mother that he was sick. So this relationship between the family, I just think adds so much fabulous detail. It's not just Joseph and his dad. Alvin's there for this, and he's part of it. And Alvin believes Joseph, and he is Joseph's cheerleader. He is totally on board. And for Lucy to mention that Alvin was part of this is just awesome. And I also really appreciate a taskmaster and the oldest son getting everybody else on board to get the work done. And I am just fascinated that Lucy, in her memories, always paints her husband in such a sweet light. It was her sensitive husband that says, you look ill. Why don't you go in? She always has him depicted so nicely. And I didn't mention that part. I should have read as well in Lucy's book, in the vision of Moroni, she includes that Moroni tells Joseph there, in her memory at least, to go tell your father and that he'll believe you. And, Joseph said that didn't come until the last appearance, which occurs next. And Lucy says, Joseph went a short distance till he came to a green sward. A sward is a portion of grass under an apple tree, where he lay down on his face, for he was too weak and he could go no further. Now, in Joseph's account of that, he says he got to the fence and he fell. He didn't have the strength to go over it. And that is completely in keeping with what we learn about Joseph later on when he's having his visions on a more regular basis, and Sydney is new to it. And do you remember he turns to Sydney, someone says, "Wow, Joseph, you look great." And Sydney looks like he's gone through the ringer. And Joseph says, actually, I'm just used to it. And I've had to develop this ability, but he was not at this time, and he not only had he been up all night, but I just think the spiritual and emotional exhaustion of being around a heavenly being, it was much more taxing than we realize. So Lucy continues on. The personage whom he saw the night before came to him again and said, "Why did you not tell your father what I told you, Joseph?" Joseph, and he saw, afraid his father would not believe him. "He will," said the angel, "believe every word you say to him. An evil spirit will try to crowd your mind, but you must keep your mind always stayed upon God, that no evil may come into your heart." And Joseph then promised to do as he was told by the angel. And when his father went to him, Joseph rehearsed to him all that he had and seen and heard. Now, we've got a couple other references that let us know that Joseph goes back out to the field and he sees Alvin, but not his dad. And he asks where his dad is, and Alvin says, "Oh, he went back in to check on you." And Joseph doesn't have the strength to go through the land. And so he tells Alvin, "Go get Dad. I need to talk to him." And Alvin does. And then Alvin and Joseph Sr. come back, and Joseph is then able to talk to his dad. I'm fascinated that not only did the angel give the message 4 times, that it was emblazoned in Joseph's mind, but that we have other people immediately involved. And this vision was not seen by anyone else, but it was expressed and told. And I think that would be empowering, not only to Joseph, but also to the relationship with Alvin and his dad. Part of the challenge, perhaps, with the first vision was that he did not have that. And the first vision is not what made everyone mad. It's what made people who were, from a Puritan perspective, concerned. But many people in the United States at this time believed in visions and revelations. But we have these 2 polar extremes. The Calvinist background that says all enthusiastic forms of the Spirit occurred only at the time of the New Testament. And then on the other extreme, everyone can have visions and directions from God. And you have many, many people that were having those experiences. But as we look at Joseph's experiences with Moroni on that first night, I just want you to pause for a minute and see what we can learn about following with exactness and how these warnings, every one of the angel's warnings that Joseph includes, at least in his abbreviated accounts, were fulfilled. And Lucy recorded them, and we have other records also by Joseph Knight that I want to read about this event, because what happened next was a fulfillment of the warnings. They said, "You've got to learn to control your mind." And it was really difficult for him. When we have Lucy's account of this, it was actually a year later that she describes some of the details, and that Joseph Knight puts the year before. So the different accounts mix up a few details, but we do know that from Lucy's book, that for this time after September 21st, that the family, as they would gather in their weekly or evening devotionals, their nightly devotionals, they have them in the night and the morning, that this became a topic where Joseph now became the teacher, not Joseph Sr., Papa, but son. This is what Lucy wrote.
From this time forth, Joseph continued to receive instructions from time to time, and every evening we gathered our children together and gave up our time to the discussion of these things which we imparted unto us. And I think that we presented the most peculiar aspect of any family that ever lived upon the earth, all seated around in a circle, father and mother, sons, daughters, listening breathlessly, in breathless anxiety to the religious teachings of a boy, 16, maybe 19. She has that up as a carrot. She doesn't remember exactly how old he was. Years of age, who had never read the Bible through, but by course in his life. For Joseph was less inclined for the study of books than any of the child we had, but much more given to reflection and deep study. And we were convinced that God was about to bring us to light. And then in Lucy's record of a year later, I have this lovely picture from the Joseph Smith papers where you can see Lucy's editing and writing things up above and scratching things out. Just go practice with a quill for an hour or two to have a little more compassion for the time and the expense of writing and the laborious job it was then. But in her account, she says, accordingly, when the time arrived, so this is the next year, we know that in Joseph's account, which I just totally skipped over because I think I assumed you could read it or else you were familiar with the fact that in the Pearl Great Price, Joseph says, I was not allowed to get the plates because I let my mind go and I had thoughts of what this wealth would mean to my family. But the next year in Lucy's account, which you may not have been introduced to, she says, accordingly, when the time arrived, he, Joseph, went to the place appointed and removed the moss and the grass from the surface of the rock, and then pried up the flat stone according to the directions which he had received, and then discovered the plates lying on 4 pillars in the inside of the box. Now, when Lucy had described them before, she mentioned that they were cement. And I just want to point that out because I think this is really significant. Moroni is not living down in the land of Nephi and Bountiful. Moroni lives up in the land of desolation. And we are told in the Book of Mormon that in the land of desolation, they did not build houses out of wood. They built their houses out of cement. And in this box, there are cement pillars. However, I do not believe this box was placed in the ground by Moroni 1,000 years before at the site where the burial of the great last battle was. There are many Comoras, and there are many different places. This box is right at the top of the surface of the land. This box is not down 1,000 years, 6 feet under. Moroni was able to pick up those plates and take them back and forth. We have at least 6 or 7 accounts of Moroni taking the plates from Joseph and transporting them for him. These plates did not necessarily sit in the ground for hundreds of years, and Moroni did not stay in the place of the last battle. He said he left and traveled for years and years and years. We do not need to worry about the location of Cumorah being archaeologically the last battle in the Book of Mormon. There is no record in the text of the Book of Mormon that ever says that. And if we are reading that into the text, I believe we are misreading it. But let's go back to Lucy's book, Lucy's record, where the 4 pillars are inside the box. He put forth his hand and he took them up. But when he lifted them from their place, the thought flashed across his mind that there might be something more in the box that would be a benefit to him in a pecuniary point of view. In the excitement of the moment, he laid the record down in order to cover up the box, lest someone should come along and take away whatever else might be deposited there. And when he turned to take up the record, it was gone. But where he knew not, nor did he know by what means it was taken away. And he was much alarmed at this, and he had kneeled down and asked the Lord why it was that the record was taken from him. And the angel appeared to him and told him that he had not done as he was commanded, and that he had laid down the record, and in order to secure some imaginary reassurance that remained after some further conversation, Joseph was then permitted to open and raise the stone again, And there he beheld the plates, and the same as before, and he reached forth his hand to take them, but he was hurled back, thrown, the angel gone, to the ground. So the angel had told Joseph not to put the plates down and not to let them out of his sight. And Joseph put them down and let them out of his sight. And the tricky part here is realizing that Joseph had told his parents about this. His siblings knew all about this. They knew that he didn't get him the first time. And then Alvin had passed away I forgot to tell you about that. You may have remembered that Alvin passed away November 19th, 1823. At least that's the date that's written on the tombstone that Hiram wrote. There is a discrepancy on what year he passed away because Lucy records it differently, and we have other records that have it as a different year as well. But it appears that he passed away just months after Moroni's first visit. And that's one of the reasons why the last thing he calls into Joseph, and Joseph records this in his canonized history, that Alvin tells him, do everything the angel says. And so the whole family stopped talking about Moroni for quite a while because it reminded them of Alvin, and they were heartsick. At least this is what we have in Lucy's records. But when the September 21st, 22nd comes around again, they are very eager for Joseph to bring these plates home. And he is learning line upon line. He is still an 18-year-old young man. And when the Lord means obey with exactness, it takes on a whole new light for me when I hear this story of Joseph just putting this 60-pound weight of metal beside his knee, right here within a hand's reach. It was not what the Lord said to do. And this learning curve that Joseph is going through teaches me so much about who Moroni is as well. I think of him usually as a general, as a leader, as a prophet, as an author, as an editor, as a fabulous son. And yet this man is an incredible teacher. And he had to school a prophet. I realized that Joseph learned in many ways from the Spirit, but Moroni really had to draw that line in the sand and repeatedly trained Joseph as to become the man that we know he became. Another record of the experience with Moroni is Joseph Knight. And just to refresh your memory, Joseph Knight is this fabulous saint from Coldsville who is very early on in Joseph's life. When Joseph goes digging for Mr. Stoll down in just over the border of Harmony, Pennsylvania, or just over the Pennsylvania border in upstate New York, Mr. Knight is in Coldsville, not too far away, and Joseph also stays and works for the Knights, and the Knights believe him and become integral, not only financially in following their promptings to support Joseph, but also, as you recall, it's his wagon that Joseph and Emma use in 1827 to actually get the plates. But I'm still back in 1824, and in Joseph Knight's record, we don't know exactly when this was recorded. It appears to be somewhere between 1838 and 1840, or 1850. But whenever he recorded it, it seems like he gets a couple of years mixed up between this first and second. But he, again, refers to this problem of putting the plates down because he thinks there's something else in the box. And the book is gone. And we hear it in Joseph Knight's words this time. And we hear Moroni speaking in Joseph Knight's vocabulary. And it's really fun to see the differences of each account. And as a historian, it's just beautiful to see how the oral histories were passed down and everybody is able to incorporate it and own it and love it. I want to just read a couple of sentences from Joseph Knight's recollections. He says, back again, he had, I'm done in the second paragraph. When he, Joseph, opened the box and beheld the book was there, he took hold of it. to take it out again. And behold, he could not stir the book any more than he could the mountain. And he explained, "Why can't I stir this book?" And he was answered, "You have not done right. You should have took the book and gone right away. You can't have it now." And Joseph says, "When can I have it?" And the answer was, "On the 22nd day of September next, and bring the right person with you." Now, Joseph Knight is recording this as if this all happened in 23. And this is another reason where we don't know exactly when Alvin's death year is, because he says, "Who's the right person?" And the angel answered, according to Mr. Knight's recollection, "Your oldest brother." Well, Alvin had passed away by that next year. He passed away just a few months after, November to September. And Joseph later says, "I'm supposed to bring somebody with me," and he looks in the seer stone and he sees Emma. And so next week, I want to talk about how Joseph meets Emma and start talking about her importance in the work as not only a sweetheart, but as a scribe, a disciple, and a missionary. And we'll start there next week.